Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This witness is Dr. Daniel Cofman, and I'd like the Chairman to have regard to Exhibit G1, which is his joint statement together with Dr. Hellman. But I would ask the Chairman to swear the witness in.
I'm sorry. You want this bundle to be marked G1?
It was marked already, Exhibit G1.
Oh,
yes.
It's just that the one in front of me is not marked.
Yes.
Or it doesn't appear to be marked.
It doesn't appear to be marked, yes.
Okay. Thank you. The registrar can swear the witness in, please.
Please state your full names for the record.
Daniel Cofman.
Do you have any objection with taking the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Yes.
Do you swear that the evidence you will give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Cofman, is it correct that you, together with Dr. Hellman, testified via Skype on the 31st of August 2018 to this commission?
Yes, this is correct.
Is it also correct that you are in possession of the transcript of the proceedings of that day?
Yes.
And have you gone through that transcript? Do you record that the evidence that's contained in that transcript is evidence that you gave?
Yes.
Thank you. On the last occasion, you did indicate to the chairperson that in response to some of the questions that you would want to elaborate when you come to South Africa.
I'm sorry, before you proceed,
Yes.
I thought you would follow up with another question.
Yes.
In the light of the fact that at the time when they testified, they were thousands of kilometers away from here, that you'd ask him. Let me ask him,
Yes.
do you confirm that the evidence that you gave at the time via a video link is true and correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do confirm that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the last occasion, then, you indicated in response to some of the questions that you would want to elaborate when you come to South Africa and testify. Just one aspect which I would like you to just confirm, which I do not recall that you confirmed according to the transcript, that you are actually an economist and a social scientist. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And having read your statement, having looked at your transcript, and having looked at the material that you provided, I decided on my own to come up with a presentation which I would like to show, and then you would indicate to me whether you believe or you want to elaborate on some of the things that I have recorded on that presentation. With your leave, Mr. Chairman, may I beg leave to present to you the presentation, which is entitled, if I may just open it, "The State Capture Phenomenon, Where Business Becomes the State." Could you just move on, or maybe even at that point, would that coincide with your understanding of when a state is said to have been captured, that would be those instances where business would become the state itself?
Thanks. And Mr. Chairman, a comment on this. That's a very powerful title for a presentation, and that's noted. In terms of the approach and the work which we have done for decades with Professor Hellman, who is not here before you today, this would be an extreme manifestation of state capture when the business become fully the state. That, however, should be also noted that state capture could have other forms and could come in more subtle ways. The way we define it is It's the ability of certain very powerful influencing group, usually from the private sector, to shape the rules of the game that basically make the state function or not. So it's shaping the institutions, the rules, the policies, the laws and regulations governing the state, which could come in various forms. An extreme form is when it becomes the state itself.
Yes, thank you. And then the
Well,
next...
I'm sorry,
I beg your
before you proceed, it might be helpful if the witness would just refresh everyone's memory of some important features of the evidence they gave before.
Yes.
I don't know to what extent what you have will reveal that, or whether it's just a continuation.
No, in fact, I wanted to start with what you're suggesting, but the
Yes.
witness preferred that we start this way. We will deal with all of those
Okay.
very, very critical features of his evidence.
Okay, all
Thank
right.
you. Okay. And then the second slide having taken from various countries, having taken from various authorities and various publications, where we've listed possible persons that may be, or entities that may be captured. You see that, this second slide? Are you there?
Yes?
Yes. And that in certain countries, it may be the president of that country, in certain countries, the ministers, it may be officials, it may be councillors, it may be the judiciary.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
And
And then on the third slide, we deal with intermediaries and enablers. This is something that you did not touch upon in your evidence when you testified on the last occasion. It was mentioned briefly that there would be many players in the industry. But then what I've identified from your evidence is these intermediaries, enablers can be many and not easy to identify. But they are important facilitators of state capture. Some private accountants, financial and tax advisors, international traders, lawyers, etc. So why is it difficult to identify the intermediaries and enablers?
well, the challenge is one of doing the proper in-depth diagnosis for each country. If and when that is done, and a number of countries have embarked on this process, and you're one, it should be possible to identify those intermediaries. But by definition, because of the nature of state capture, they tend to operate in the shadow, and there are many preconditions for basically shedding light on that shadow. I can refer that to it later as we go through the transcript, and you may have detailed questions regarding particular cases and how long it may take until all of this is unearthed. But with the proper political will, resolve, and then technical work and investigative work, it is possible to unearth and identify who these enablers are. It's very important to recognize that between the captor, that those that seek to shape the laws, the regulations, and the policies of the state, and those that are captured, they are very important facilitators and enablers. It's not done just between two parties. Usually it's a complex web, and doing the proper diagnosis that will vary from country to country, but it is possible.
Yes, thank you. And then you've already mentioned the capture, which is on this next slide. Who should be the entity, the person, or the firm that would have control over the intermediaries, enablers, and may seize public power, influential business people, particular economic conglomerates, military, etc. Yes.
That's indeed the case.
Yes.
And in some settings and countries also, the mafias, drug traders, very powerful illicit economic interests play a role. In some others, it could be some part of the more traditional economic or financial elite. So it will vary from setting to setting.
Yes, thank you. And then the next slide is, these are the potential sectors that you've identified in your report. not all of them, but some of them, as being the sectors that can be captured, being the extractive and the mining sector, the industrial sector, energy, financial, communication, and military. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that, again, I want to stress, take this opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to stress the importance of acknowledging the particularities of this challenge in every country. And that's one of the reasons I commend your commission and the work that it is doing. But nobody can come from the outside and have a particular template or Bible that says where it all happens. As the expression goes, to use, if you allow me, a bit of lightness, why do so many robbers are interested in robbing a bank? It's because that's where the money is. Well, it's a useful, simplistic approach to start looking at this issue. When one does a diagnosis within a country, it will depend where the sources of major rent for that elite would be. In some countries would be the oil sector, which is, we focus in many countries on that, which is subject to capture of the rents. Others is a financial sector, others it could be both. So it will vary from country to country depending on the particularity of the country.
Yes, thank you. And then I've just entitled matters that we've identified as red flags, so to speak. So you deal with sponsorships and donations, charities and educational foundations, trusts, mismanaged and unduly influenced state-owned enterprises or through privatization, illicit political finance, beneficiary ownership, financial benefits to dependents or family members, monopoly over fishing, mining, energy, communication rights, and financial benefits to the members of the executive from foreign countries. I will take you to some of these later on in your evidence. But is there any particular one that you believe that I've left out from your summaries?
I think this is a comprehensive enough first list. Some further details can come out through the details later. I should stress also that since already it's clear that you are doing very, very important work on that, there may be some features that you have emphasized here, which may be particular here, which we would not have emphasized, and we have not seen it in our previous work. Like you mentioned at first, sponsorships and donations. You would know best how that works here, yes, and whether that's a particular feature. That does not come from our work. Yes. And the only other comment for now, to put it in context, that could be quite unique to here. On the other hand, the challenge of state-owned enterprises being utilized as a vehicle for capture, and the distortion of basic policies, the use of public funds and so on, that is quite common in this field, and it's something that is a major challenge that we're trying to help with in other countries, particularly in the oil sector. We have studied that in the context of the organization I lead, but also it's clear in other sectors as well. So that you have mentioned here, it's yes, a challenge that it's quite common in yes, many other countries, of how state-owned enterprises do not operate in the best commercial, financial, and economic interests of the country, of the public good, but are essentially part of the captured environment for the benefit of the few.
Yes, thank you. And then the next slide, we deal with administrative corruption as you deal with it in your statement, and regulatory corruption, state capture. But what I would not want you to comment on these, because the questions that I'm going to be asking you later on, they relate to the distinction between these concepts, which we will have to deal with. But you've just summarized your report insofar as those are indicated therein. And then the next slide then is the consequences of state capture. The erosion of the economy, the costs to entire society, that it may plunge country into recession, it may affect poor members of society, destroys competition, it affects countries' borrowing capacity, and it may lead to unemployment and increase of state grant dependency. But I'm going to now, with all of that summary, then take you so that you can put that summary into context. As to when you're talking about state capture, you've already told us what it means, but we'd like you to repeat it now because maybe other people didn't hear it properly when you explained via the video link that the whole concept, you had coined the term state capture together with Dr. Hellman. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Yes. And then in simple terms, what do you mean when you say a state is captured?
Yeah. First, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again for this opportunity and to be in person. Here, it is my honor and privilege being before you in person and in your wonderful country. But to give credit where credit is due, we did not invent the term capture, and we did not invent all what is in this framework. But as it's usual in academic work, we studied in depth the previous literature as well as the reality as we saw it on the ground. As well, we're serious believers in evidence-based analysis, evidence-based advice, and evidence-based policy making. So we did a lot of surveys to collect data about the situation. A lot of credit goes to other writers in the in the past, but particularly one Nobel Prize in economics, George Stigler, who wrote first about regulatory capture. And it did encompass the sense of very powerful interest being able to influence particular regulations in an economy. So that already had been developed. What we did is pick up on that, but broaden it. And I think that's a clarification, if you allow me to make it very broadly here, because I know that this is a legally oriented commission, which is commendable. Yet it's very important to understand our concept beyond only the laws, the legal aspects of that. The concept that we developed and we made it very clear is the shaping of the rules of the game in a particular nation by those influential few we use usually, but not always, illicit means to do so. And these rules of the game, by these rules of the game, we mean the laws, yes, included, but not only. And in some countries, that's mostly expressed through the implementing regulations and other such regulations. So it's the laws, the regulations, the policies. What happens with macroeconomic policies and so on? There's a lot of discretion in any country within the constitution and within the existing laws, yes, yet they can be captured. The allocation of public expenditure, what happens in state-owned enterprises, whether the procurement system is rigged or not, could still be in a context where the constitutions and the laws in the constitutions were not necessarily unduly shaped by that particular captor elite. That could have started very well, but it's in the context of these policies and regulations and institutions that are captured that these could happen. So in that sense, I want to draw the distinction and the broadening of the term from the original notion of regulatory capture or even legal capture, we were very narrowly focused on that, to make it broader to also encompass all policies, implementing regulations, as well as institutions, the key institutions in the state.
Seeing that you've already touched on regulatory capture, could you define for us, because this is an aspect that you deal with in paragraph 7 of your statement, you deal with administrative corruption, you deal with regulatory corruption. Could you just define those, because there seems to be a very fine line between the two, and also to make it easy for one, when you present it with facts at the end of the day, to see whether this is indeed regulatory corruption or administrative corruption. Could you just deal with those two concepts?
Okay. As already suggested, but elaborating on that, Mr. Chairman, administrative corruption takes place when there is bribery or related illicit action that basically provides a private gain and a private benefit to one individual in the implementation of a particular regulation or a particular law. If I have accumulated certain sanctions for being drunk, for drunk driving, or trying to get rid of parking ticket violations, and I pay a bribe, or for red tape, to try to get around red tape in my company, and so on, and facilitate from my own individual benefit which is insidious, and it should not be happening, but that does not necessarily have a major impact throughout society and for the public good to everybody else. That's administrative corruption. And that we distinguish. So that's in the implementation of a particular regulation or norm. If instead we're talking about altering and shaping these laws, these regulations, these institutions, helping influence it and distort them so that ultimately the benefit is for myself or a small group in the elite, and it's usually at the expense of the public good to the rest of society. That's what we're talking about in terms of state capture. And again, I want to make the distinction that's broader than the original notion of regulatory capture, which only focus on particular regulation. But here we're talking about institutions also and about policies.
And then this regulatory corruption, administrative corruption and state capture, you associate, when you titled some of the headings, they refer to countries that are in transition. Can we find these in countries that are actually stable, that are old, that are not in transition at all?
That's another excellent question, Mr. Chairman. And before fully embarking into that, just like I gave an example in the case of administrative corruption, as like when there's red tape and one tries to get around the red tape paying a bribe. A very potent example of what happens with state capture, which doesn't necessarily imply that that somebody shaped the constitution in a particular way. It's on political financing. And the rules, regulations, and the system of party and political finance, it's something that evolves over time, and an enormous amount of abuses take place in many settings in the world to affect particularly those policies and subsequent laws that are passed through parliament in many countries. So that's an example of how a system can be influenced. The same can happen with, as we said, through state-owned enterprises and through public expenditure and through other such things which have major impact and investment. So now, in terms of the issue of in transition, it's essentially to recognize the notion that countries that have been in transition, the institutions are either more in flux, because they're also in transition, they're evolving, they're being developed, and or they start from a rather weak initial standpoint. And for either of those two reasons, or for both, the vulnerability to being captured in the process, because the institutions are being shaped during those transitions, and the laws, and the implementing regulations, and the policies, there is a higher probability of being amenable to capture. It's very important to recognize also how do we interpret transition. Transition is not unique to what we used to call developing countries, and I'm a proud citizen of a country that was labeled as a developing country. Was it Chile? Now we're a proud emerging economy and part of OECD. Those transitions also take place in very industrialized and very rich countries. Many of us are observing with much concern the transition is beginning to take place, has begun, and will probably have major impact in the case of Britain and Brexit. That's going to be a major transition where many institutions, rules, laws, regulations would have to be reformulated and are going to traverse. So that's the first clarification. Transition doesn't mean developing country status. It's common in emerging economies. We were in transition, and in some sense, we're just at the end of a very important transition post-military dictatorship in Chile, which was Pinochet until the late 80s. It took a generation to that for that transition to occur. I'm not going to belabor now on the details, but it takes a long time. The Soviet system went into transition once the Red Curtain falls, and in many ways is still in transition. I've come here from Ukraine, still a country very much in transition, where many of the institutions have been subject to this challenge of capture in one form or another. So there's a higher vulnerability in country in transition, but it's not only. To illustrate a country that has not been in full-fledged transition, with very robust institutions since sometimes in 1900s, after having experienced enormously high and corrosive corruption, is the United States itself. And it took a very long time for that transition to occur. After the Civil War, historically, things did improve. There were hiccups with the Tammany Hall experience of the political movement out of New York and so on. Then there was a recovery and much improvement, but nowadays it's a serious concern, and then given the political changes, that some forms, however subtle or not subtle, of state capture have returned, even in the case of the United States, which if there is interest, I can elaborate further later. But it's to illustrate that that can also happen in countries which are typically not labeled in transition.
Yes. Then you would get a question from someone from South Africa, where South Africa has, according to South Africa now, as we find it now, has its foundational values entrenched in the Constitution, which we regard as one of the best constitutions in the world. Now, then someone is going to say, but when all the laws were promulgated, all of the laws after 1994, at least, they had to be consistent with the values espoused in the Constitution. So you have that situation then in South Africa where we know that everything has to be constitutionally compliant. How then does one associate regulatory corruption with a state such as South Africa as we find it now?
Thanks. An excellent and a complex issue again that you are asking, and Mr. Chairman, the first thing that I would want to clarify is that the assessment of the situation in South Africa is yours. I'm not an expert in South Africa, so that's of high interest, and I'm of course very interested in informing myself while I'm here on that. So I speak from the experience of other countries. Countries like the United States, and some others, have very robust also and proud constitutions. There have been amendments because the times evolve, and as times evolve, there's always a need to refresh the legal framework, reinterpret, have amendments, and so on. Just to illustrate, since we just discussed the United States, and also to put it very frankly and clearly that this problem of state capture is not of one type of particular country or economy. It's not an issue for developing countries in particular, or so on. The United States, which has had a very robust constitution, and then with its amendments, they have had over time interpretations, and it goes, because it's common law, interpretations, they go to the Supreme Court on that, what constitutes corruption and bribery. Under the existing laws, as of 2 years ago, as of a few years ago, what constitutes bribery and corruption, the former governor, and at the time was sitting governor of Virginia, was then indicted, was prosecuted, indicted, and then ended up serving time because of illicit gifts that he had received while in office from a contractor that subsequently got particular contracts. Is appealed, goes up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court essentially uses that case to redefine and narrow the definition of bribery and corruption by suggesting that that was not sufficient to prove there was corruption. There had to be a much more direct and totally proven link between the two events, the gift that was provided on the one hand and then the subsequent decision, which is it's considered in the governance field as overly restrictive and draconian, and therefore it would leave many people who are engaged in bribery and corruption with impunity. That's, as an analyst, I'm suggesting that, but the main point here is to illustrate that the laws are a very important institution in a country at a particular moment, but they do evolve even when there is a constitution. So what was illegal up to a year and a half ago in the United States regarding a possible bribery offense, now it's legal. That goes also to the notion that we have explored in the past that bribery can be, or capture, can be done through legal means according to the laws of the moment in that country, which doesn't mean that that cannot change. Conversely, and not to be also fair to many robust institutions in the United States, after the Wall Street crisis, following that major debacle which had major worldwide consequences, and the Wall Street crisis is a case study on capture of the financial regulatory system by Wall Street and related elite. After that, there's a reaction, there's institutional reaction suggesting the robustness and the resilience of the political and related institutions in the United States. As a result, major regulation and legal changes take place in the form of the Dodd-Frank financial sector bill, which makes many things that were legal before illegal in terms of the activities in the financial sector. Again, it's a way of suggesting that these laws do evolve over time, and different groups may have different type of influences on those laws, some through legitimate lobbying and part of the competitive political discourse, but some, they could be undue and it could be going the wrong direction. Unfortunately, right now, there is a movement to undo many of those tighter regulations of the financial sector, again, because of the interests of the financial elite in the United States and the present political environment. Most of it has not yet been undone, and it goes to show that the resilience of the institutions are important. But the point here is that we are in a dynamic context where the laws, the regulations, the policy of every country evolves, even in the context of a very robust initial constitution and set of laws.
Yes, thank you. In your statement, you deal with the issue of governance weaknesses as being some of the causes of state capture. And then could you just elaborate on that and just show briefly why governance deficiencies would cause that or would lead to it?
In simple terms, and Mr. Chairman, thanks again for a very apt question. In simple terms, we're dealing with a complex interplay between the chicken and the egg. First, and you showed it in your summary slide very well, when state capture is present, that those actions by the captor, abetted by the intermediaries, the facilitators, and the enablers, can have major consequences. Some of those consequences are on the broader governance structures of the country itself. In some countries, and it's particularly noteworthy in some countries in Latin America, not the Brazils or the Chiles, who have made much progress, but in others, many countries of the former Soviet Union, the judiciary has been totally captured. So the undermining of the governance, the key governance institutions, whether it's in rule of law, in terms of economic management and policy making and so on, takes place as a result of capture. And that would be one of the slight additions I would have suggested in your nice framework that you put it, is not only the social, economic, and other costs you put, but the cost in terms of the governance institutions being weakened and undermined. And let's not underestimate and call it by its name, the undermining of democratic institutions. In countries where that have been in transition, democracy is already dynamic and vibrant, but if a very small elite captures the system, in the eyes of the rest of the population, there is a major loss of legitimacy of those very democratic institutions. And in Latin America, we have had it from time to time, such political influencing inequality that arises. There are talks about military coup against and so on, after having left behind this military dictatorship for a long time, and the appetite then of considering, well, maybe we would not be so bad under military dictatorship if instead the alternative is a completely captured system in the economic and social sense. So I want to stress that linkage. Of course, the other side of the causality direction, the direction from going of weak initial institutions to enabling state capture to occur, it's also present. And that goes to your previous question, why do you focus in countries in transition? When the Soviet Union collapses, in some sense, it becomes almost like a blank check in terms of all the institutions that have to start from scratch, consistent with political competition and democratic institutions as well as economic competition. What to do with all the state assets that begin to be privatized and what happens to them. So depending how weak those governance structures are at the initial point, that can also influence the extent to which state capture occurs. So essentially the direction goes in both ways. The initial governance strength or weakness of the institutions of the state when a process starts is a very important determinant about the vulnerability to state capture. And conversely, once state capture occurs, that has a very pernicious effect on the further development of the governance institutions in the country.
Yes. I know that in one of the answers to one of the questions, you've made it very clear that you are not here to talk about South Africa because you have not researched South Africa.
And because
yes,
you know it much better.
Yes, thank you. And then can we then just deal with one other issue that you dealt with in your report at page 38, where you now say once a state finds that, or once there is what is state capture in any state, what are the solutions? I had taken you through this in your previous testimony, but I would like you to give examples to the Commission because you had undertaken to come back and give examples of some of the countries that were found to be in a situation where there was state capture, and what steps did they take to try and redress that situation.
Sure. I can do that. Now, it's very important to recognize how incredibly complex this issue is, and that's why it's commendable what you're doing. And there are pitfalls in just picking a country and suggesting that the whole country is a success. We are in an imperfect world with great leaders, great institutions, enlightened countries in many cases, but also there are other forces, other institutions. So there will be progress in some areas and not in others. There will be two steps forward and one step backward, even when there is progress. But of course, I cannot help, if you allow me, to say a few things about the case of my own country in Chile, where first it's very important to study and recognize the historical antecedents in every country. In the Soviet Union, for instance, the Soviet system, in many ways, if we study it with data and very clearly, there was very significant corruption throughout the system, and how the elite, in fact, basically benefited in a very particular ways at the expense of the rest of the population. So it's very easy sometimes to only focus on what happened a few years ago. In Brazil, everybody's focused on what has happened very recently in the case of the car wash scandal and so on. But we have this the understanding and the review of already this has been going on for 20 years, and one has to understand the military dictatorship antecedent and how that had a major impact. In the case of Chile, it is a case that historically there were already enlightened leaders who imparted the absolute paramount importance of serving in being public servants and serving with full integrity and doing away from lack of integrity practices. That was already historical, starting in fact from the first founder of the country, Bernardo O'Higgins, and who becomes the first leader in the country. We're talking about 1812, if you allow me. And one of his first decrees was to order, at that time, the presidential house. It's a presidential palace, but it's not so much of a palace. The outside walls had to be plastered with all the names of the top officials and the high officials and what were their incomes and assets. This is 1812. We're now in almost 2020. In how many countries there's still reticence to do some such basic work? But this is to illustrate that it's very important to go back to history. And then there are many other antecedents where there are problems, but governance improves, and then there are setbacks. And these are setbacks under the dictatorship of Pinochet. The mid-70s to late 80s, and eventually was discovered that there was a lot of corruption, including by the leader of that, and the association with the particulars of the private elite was already a form of capture then. And then major reforms start to take place. And two major findings that we have already with Joel Hellman from our initial work on state capture from the Soviet Union, which post-Soviet countries, we're talking about 27, did better, and which ones went the capture way, which ones went the competitive way. And there's a clear distinction, and I discussed that briefly last time, between the two types. The countries in the Baltics, the Slovenians, and others have gone competitive, so it's nothing predetermined, versus countries like Ukraine and Russia, Azerbaijan, and others. So there are two distinct types. Two major issues that come out very clearly as associated with the extent of capture or lack thereof. One, political contestability, the extent that there is a vibrant competition politically, and associated with that civil liberties, the voice of civil society, the engagement of civil society, are they there or are they suppressed? Like in Central Asia, unfortunately, that's the case now, the voice of that. So that's one, the political contestability and competition era. The other is economic contestability and competition. To what extent a vibrant, medium, small-scale sector is allowed to operate, enter, and operate, even if there are large enterprises. Is there enough competition, rather than in the former Soviet Union we call them oligarchs. Is there one or two oligarchs, or maybe there are 20 and 25, and then already competition ensues, as well as the next stage, medium and longer scale. So the extent of that economic contestability, economic competition is very important. And for that, obviously, opening the doors to the rest of the world, having investors and the presence of more global industries also can be very important, although some misbehave in terms of governance and corruption. We can discuss that. But overall, the openness and the competition in that context is very, very important. Then one gets into the details. Those are very large buckets, but obviously the extent to which anti-monopoly regulation in the country effectively works is extremely important to assure competition in the economic sphere. In the political sphere, it's extremely important the extent to which, not only to which there is political competition among parties in a very open, legitimate way, and total open and voice of civil society, but the extent to which there is democracy within each party. In Chile, one of the things that we have to do, following some scandals, including regarding party financing and so on, one of the major reforms that were undertaken is opening up the system of electing the leaders within each political party. So the whole notion of how political parties function and how can they be made more open and democratic, which is a significant challenge in my region, in Latin America, it's a key issue on that. And then there are obviously major advances that have been made, including in my country, in Chile, regarding the whole procurement process. That's another institution that tends to be captured. First, transparency is absolutely crucial, and putting everything online and making it contestable and subject to appeal. But also the system, how competitive the bidding takes place, it's absolutely key. And for now, last and least, because it's also a great experience in the case of Chile, meritocracy, the importance of instituting and having as part of the DNA of the institutions in the country that is meritocratic, be it the civil service, the judiciary, but very importantly also state-owned enterprises, how the boards are constituted, and the top executive on state-owned enterprises and in regulatory agencies. There's a commission which is totally independent, including outsiders from the public sector and government and other experts, that essentially provides 3 top candidates to the decision-making body, be it parliament or the president, regarding the top agencies. And that politicians, or those politicians, can only choose after that meritocratic system. Now, some allowance for the political process should be there, and the politicians should have been elected to power, should have the say, but they have to choose from that trio that is chosen according to meritocratic, just to suggest. There were so many thousands, tens and tens of thousands of political appointees. Whenever a government changed hands, political appointees went very low in terms of the totem pole of the civil service. Nowadays, that has been capped, and it's a very clear and limited amount which are political appointees. The rest is all on technocratic grounds. So these are just to suggest that the type of reforms in that direction which are very important. Last but not least, on political campaign finance. There is a major role that the public sector plays in providing public finance, which is equal across parties in terms of also access to TV and so on, to make the system more equal and less amenable to private influencing, and very, very strict caps and bans regarding private contributions to political finance. So it's to suggest the whole sphere of different areas where one would have to cover, but of course it depends on the particular vulnerability and nature of the capture in each country, where the homework needs to be done, which institutions are the most amenable to capture. The whole issue of state-owned enterprises and the reform of state-owned enterprises, the state of the art has advanced significantly in terms of what to do to improve. The issue is mostly at this stage nowadays not so much technical, it's political will. It's a political will to do it, to make them truly independent, commercialized. I reject and as an analyst, we have done a lot of homework. I reject the notion that the only solution is privatization. Privatization, if well done, in a particular form, it makes sense in some cases, but not in others. State-owned enterprise, if the reforms do take place, and then they can perform the role that they should be performing, it can be efficient. Recently, an assessment was done of over 80 state-owned enterprises in oil, gas, and mining around the world. And I'm very proud to suggest, and I didn't have any role in the methodology, that Codelco, the Chilean mining company, came out ahead of even Statoil, the Norwegian oil company, and others from industrial countries. So, and the state-owned enterprises from India, from other emerging economies, came out rated and assessed very, very highly. So yes, it can be done.
Yes, thank you. And then maybe you could just as well, now that you're dealing with the examples, these countries, and then just give us an example of Peru, because you had indicated at page 106 of the transcript that you would elaborate on that, on the position of the Peruvian state.
Well, Peru, it's another context that's been very dynamic, and they made some strides, unfortunately less than the potential that could have been. And number one, again, it's really important in Peru to recognize now the following. Yes, the president, up to about 8 months ago or so, up to recently, President Fujimori had to leave power, was basically sacked because he was associated with a major corruption and capture scandal started in Brazil under the car wash scandal, which I can refer the case of Brazil because it's quite interesting in that, and I had promised that if there's time and interest. But it goes to show first that some of these corruption and state capture nowadays is transnational in nature, and it's very important to always look at the role of outsiders in that, both enablers in our field, which is oil, gas, and mining, which is one of the areas I focus on. There are some commodity traders in the oil business who do not necessarily behave and act in the best interest of the nation where the oil, gas, and mining is being purchased, as opposed to some now more enlightened transnational, multinational mining companies that are operating at a much higher standard of governance, realizing that ultimately it pays for the country, but it pays in the long run for them. So first is to recognize this international dimension. That has become very clear recently in the case of Peru. The president loses his job, but this is not a recent phenomenon. And again, it's really important to go back to history. Many people are focused during the military regime of President Fujimori, who also ended up in prison. So one can say some of the institutions do work because there's no impunity. I ended up in prison, and the system that he had with the chief of intelligence, Montesinos, which was a different type of capture because it started from that political intelligence elite, but then they were in cahoots with the top business elite, some in the top business elite. They also captured the media, which is a very important issue here, the freedom of the press, which is something we can relate to later. But in that context, even what happened under the military regime of Fujimori, and we're talking about the 80s into the 90s, already had antecedents of corruption under a previous administration, which was more democratic, but with fragile institutions. The President Garcia, where the particular relationship with the elite had already begun to take place. So already there was a history since then. In recent times, in the recent months, because of what has recently happened in terms of the scandal of corruption, which was a bit more transnational in nature, and because of nowadays the press is no longer captured like there was before, because of the civic space that is provided and the citizens demanding change, there is increasing attention to that by the top political leadership, who have begun to enact certain laws and policies to try to move forward and address these issues of corruption and capture. But this is incipient, and there one has to recognize that there is a deep historical background that has to be brought into play in understanding these issues of capture. They do not happen overnight, and they do not usually just happen under the one regime.
Thank you. And then from that answer, one gets the sense that from what you've told us, that there's different forms of state capture. They come in different forms and shapes, and one has to look at a particular form that presents itself before that particular country at that time.
That's
yeah.
right.
Yes. And then once then a country has found that it has been captured, what is the best way of dealing with it?
First, I would want to encourage a broader debate and discussion, because you know the case of South Africa better, what the notion of discovery also means. I assume it's not an overnight epiphany, but it's already a process of observing and basically also feeling the consequences of a particular types of misgovernance, corruption that may be taking place already for some time. And then it takes the work of a commission like yours, and I know that many academics here are working on and so on, to fully unearth what are the major manifestations, what's really happening. And I know there were major reports issued late, or not so late last year, by the chief prosecutor and so on, and that's part of the process that one goes on. I know that in legal terms you have the notion of discovery, but it's a process, it's a dynamic process. Similarly, the response to it, which is absolutely crucial, and I commend you because it's for what you're trying to do, and this is such a historical opportunity here in that case. That has to be homegrown, and it has to draw, and I'm very pleased to have been invited here with also Joel Hellman having testified, and we can provide suggestions from the rest of the world, but it's more in terms of what they did, and they did in response to A, B, C, and D. And you would know best what it's applicable or not. I would start this as a way of thinking about the issue in terms of asking the questions regarding of what are the most vulnerable institutions that have been subject to capture, and why, and what are the forces behind it. In terms of the forces behind it, one has to look, and I speak as an economist, in terms of the incentives. Why were these incentives for those that were trying, successfully or not, to capture? Why were they there rather than saying, no, that's not in our interest? As was told by Professor Hellman in our joint discussion from afar, or a few weeks ago, it is in our human nature, that's as part of researchers, we know that we try to influence others and influence decisions. That's true everywhere. The question is how to organize and regulate that influencing so that it is competitive, it's legitimate. There are many civil society groups, legitimate groups, that want influencing in one form or another to take place that does inform the parliament, and that's part of a vibrant democratic process. The problem is when it becomes monopolized by the few that influence. And that gets into the very important issues of conflict of interest and lobby law regulations. So there's a whole bucket there that the country would want to look at it, any country, in terms of whether it's appropriate to ensure a vibrant, competitive influencing. Not that one cannot eliminate the influence. It's part and parcel. The same about the regulations and system of political campaign financing, because it plays such a key role. So that's another area. The issue of public service reform related to meritocracy, we just mentioned that, is another area of focus, and something that it was much focus in the case of Chile that has been dealt with. Then there are the issues around state-owned enterprises, which you did mention recently, and then, of course, the issues of judiciary. At the end of the day, progress in these, including, absolutely crucial, the freedom of the media, and as opposed to capture of the media, which has been a problem in many countries. The freedom of the media, coupled with the accountability that civil society leaders in the outside can demand from the public service and government, has proven crucial. And that has proven why in Chile, Parliament didn't have incentives. The Congress and the Parliament, the lawmakers, many of these laws had to be passed on political finance. It's against their interest. But why eventually they were adopted? They had no choice. There was such a groundswell of support and pressure from civil society mobilized and groups that look at what happened, and these are the recommendations of a commission. The recommendation of a commission, either we do it or we are out in the next election. And many of these leaders put them on notice. This, affects the voting. So those different type of aspects need to be looked at, but which ones are crucial in the country. But to end, what's absolutely crucial, all this can be happening, including transparency reforms, which are crucial, we haven't discussed enough. But if at the end of the day all this happens, but it's full impunity, then it has very little traction or impact. So how rule of law functions and the absence or existence of impunity is crucial. And that's what has made the difference, and that's why even with a lot of problems, Brazil is making progress. So they had a major scandal, the major discovery of the system of state capture was discovered because the judiciary had been strengthened, and there were very courageous investigators and judges that went out there and then unearthed the whole web of capture and corruption that involved the whole political elite, that their own personal human risk in much context. But it was because the judiciary had been strengthened. Associated with that strengthening was the adoption and use of plea bargaining. Plea bargaining as a tool for discovery and unearthing the whole problem in the system, and not just with one particular individual captors. Captors are not one individual. It's usually a whole web of systems. It could be a group of industrialists working together, or a group in the financial sector having met in the shadows for a very, very long time. So it takes one of them to tell the whole story. If there's plea bargaining, that's happening. We're witnessing this in another context in the United States, in the case of right now of the Mueller probe. But in the case of Brazil, that was absolutely crucial. So there are all these type of innovations and reforms that different countries are undertaking. I am reticent to say this is one country with a great success. Of course, I'm proud of Chile. We still have challenges there and unfinished business. But it's very important to focus on particular areas where some countries have made enormous progress. The same country may not be making the same progress on other areas.
So in those countries where it has been found that there were these transgressions, people were brought to book, so to speak, and you believe that if that happens at the end of the day, after all the evidence has been laid, all the findings are made, that would be a necessary process to be undertaken.
If I can just have one comment about that. Just as I, Mr. Chairman, as I just made the case that obviously where in settings where there is complete impunity, there can be enormous progress on the rest, but the country will have significant challenge. Speaking very frankly, I have been a student in this issue for decades, and I like to pair countries to study that share the same historical, cultural antecedents and so on. Chile and Argentina. Argentina was much richer and much better off than Chile. We have now crossed paths because of governance in other directions. Chile and Mexico are also, it's very interesting because in Chile, rule of law has been very, very important, and there have been improvements and strong. There was more reticence of having transparency reforms, particularly for a variety of reasons. There was much more anxiety regarding that. The converse in Mexico, who made many transparency reforms, while the judicial rule of law is, to put it mildly, a huge challenge. And that's why Mexico is not making the progress that it should in spite of those other reforms. Well, Chile eventually adopted transparency and so on. At the end of the day, it's not one that will work. So you said, you put it very rightly, rule of law versus impunity is very important, it's necessary, but at the same time will not be sufficient on its own. It has to be complemented by these systemic reforms that we're discussing. This is our observation in other countries. Maybe you come to a different conclusion in South Africa, but it has to be what happens with state-owned enterprises, what happens in any country, and what happens with the meritocracy in appointments in the public service, what happens with political campaign finance. All these other areas, if they are far, far behind, then there are going to be a major pullback in not allowing these reforms to progress, even if there is no impunity. So it's not just impunity or prosecutions alone.
Yes, and then you've linked the whole issue of transparency, conflict of interest with beneficiary ownership. Could you just elaborate on that?
This is one, and I'm glad you asked about that, Mr. Chairman. It's one example, potent illustration of the notion that that even if the country is not in transition, the whole legal, regulatory, institutional system in any country, because the world evolves so significantly, has to be in transition, has to be very dynamic and evolve with the times. In the old days, there was very little ability for the corrupt to engage in, through technology now, and other means in placing the monies abroad, in releasing the whole issue, illicit financial flows and so on has taken particular prominence in our modern era. It was not such an issue 30 years ago. And given the magnitudes of the rents related to state capture and the ability of many to appropriate that and put them elsewhere, that has been very important. All of a sudden, speaking about discovery, we get this major worldwide scandal, which I'm confident you are aware of, which is called the Panama Papers disclosure, and where is that provides a major impetus for many in our realm and others who are pushing for a long time to have much more disclosure and much more transparency in who are the real owners of the major corporations, enterprises, activities, and also those that are bidding for licenses for the gems of the country, whether it's in mining or in oil and so on. So we have been asking for a long time for full disclosure. One of my roles is also to sit as a member of the international board in the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which has more than 50 countries. There's a hope that someday maybe South Africa would wish to join. But it's helping with the norms regarding full transparency, accountability, and governance in the oil mining and gas sector across the world. So there was the pushed to try to have much more disclosure regarding who are the real owners that benefit from all these deals, which is very important for anti-corruption and for mitigating state capture. There was a lot of resistance. Panama paper scandal happens, and the resistance had to be much more muted, and there was a big push, and therefore new regulations and requirements. In this case, it's a requirement globally, but every country decides whether to adopt it in the law or not, as to have full disclosure of who the actual owners are, and through that, one ought to be able to see, well, are there very high officials, high-level politicians that are involved in these commercial oil licenses, and are they related to the Ministry of Oil? This is just an example. So what's called in international legal lingo the PEPs, the politically exposed people, there will be a major progress regarding that. This is to illustrate that there are certain innovations regarding laws and regulations that happen over time, even in a country, irrespective of how robust the original constitution and set of laws are. The same applies to anything related to technology. Obviously, the laws and regulations regarding that have to be adapted to a completely new era nowadays compared with 50 years ago. So there are all kinds of innovations there. But regarding the public disclosure registries in terms of every country having it, vis-a-vis their beneficiary owners, both of the company, but also for the licensings, which are where the rents, licensing on natural resources which belong to the people. So if you're going to get a license, one wants to know who is bidding, and of course transparency about the contracts and transparency about the payments that are given to government. That's one of the major progresses that has taken place over the past 10 years regarding transparency and beneficiary ownership. Is evolving still, and many countries have not implemented, but it's one of those.
And you had referred us to the emoluments clause that exists in the United States. Could you just mention that to the chairperson, which deals with receipt of gifts?
Well, that's a very particular case, that is a legal case that is taking place right now in the United States. And emoluments clause, it's a clause that comes in the Constitution by the original writers of the Constitution of the United States. We're talking essentially 250 plus years ago, that were enlightened enough to say that no holder of high office, including the president, shall be allowed to receive any gifts from any foreign entity, particularly foreign government, or even officials of the different states of the United States, the governor and so on. So there can be no undue influencing either from abroad or even from the other state, for both national interest, but national security, but also in terms of probity and integrity. There have been many question marks and issues that have arisen under the current leadership and administration in the United States, and one of them is the undue influencing of commercial business interests that may be tainting the public, the decision-making by the top leader for the public good. So as a result, the leadership of one state, the state of Maryland, and some former officials of U.S. administration, we happen to be the ethics czars, in charge of ethics of both, in one case, a Republican administration, President Bush, and in the other case of Obama administration. They're both jointly in this case, basically trying to bring to trial for the president for violating the emoluments clause, because the president supposedly, according to the allegations, had been benefiting from his own investments that he does have in the United States, and particularly example is the Trump hotel in Washington, D.C., which is close to the White House, which supposedly or allegedly may have received basically foreign guests and have, as well as as leaders of particular states, and as a result benefiting from those. So that's a case. It's moving through the courts, and of course the last thing is for me to comment on how it may end up. It's just coming, but it's to illustrate for one that the Constitution can be very robust and work, and it can be used also by the legal system and the court to respond when there is a alleged case of misgovernance or corruption or state capture, however it's labeled by the law of the particular country, so that there is a response. So this is just one illustration that sometimes the Constitution can be helpful in this context.
Yes. And then maybe just on that issue of transparency, just the example that you gave us the other day of you having invited someone over to your house and the restrictions on what to offer that person and the extent to which you can go as a host to make your guests comfortable.
It's a quick anecdote, but also I'm glad you're asking me this now, because it's too easy right now to be totally critical about one country or totally effusive for another. That's why I was being also cautious. My own country, Chile, we still have our challenges. In the case of the United States, there are enormous strengths, institutional strength that should be commended, and that's part and parcel of governance in a country. No country, in the definitions I give about governance, the good governance, absence of state capture or of corruption, that doesn't exist, and therefore that's not the definition, absence of corruption, that doesn't exist anywhere, that should be equated with stellar governance. Good governance is when challenges happen, that do happen everywhere, is the ability of the system, the institutions, the rule of law to respond to it. And that's what we have done in Chile. In the United States, for better or worse, that's happening. There are going to be midterm elections and so on. And where it's very serious in the United States, the rules and regulations and laws around governmental ethics, governing public service. And just as an illustration, they cannot receive gifts from the outsider. When I was heading the World Bank office in Ukraine in the early days of transition there, I invited a very high-level official of one of the agencies of agriculture, who used to be in the World Bank before, so I knew him. I invited him for dinner, and he said, I can accept dinner as long as you promise that it's not going to be a very luxurious dinner, because I cannot accept even in kind anything that would exceed the cost of $50. But it's just to illustrate that in those systems that is part of the DNA, even if at a higher level there may be attempts at capture, as we have discussed.
Yes. And then maybe if you could just deal briefly with the cost of state capture to a country. You've dealt with this in your report, and we have a section in the slide. If we may just go back to the slide. You've just put up 2 examples. Could you just go back to that? Sure. Okay, thank you. The first slide. Sorry, the first one. First slide.
You're waiting for me or for the slides?
No, the slide is going to come up. Sorry.
Oh, the slides are going
yes.
to come up, okay. Yes. So you already summarized it very well at the beginning. In fact, in the next, if you had shown everybody a slide after that.
Let's see, which one is it? No, the slide. Let's go down. Sorry.
Keep
Yeah,
going.
that one. Yes, thank you. That's the slide.
That's one slide. And
that's one slide, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That slide does come from us. The rest
yes.
was your excellent work. Ms. Norman, excellent work. That is from our original work, one of the summaries of the data, which we did summarize in the earlier hearing that we had with Professor Hellman present, it is also fully explained in the statement. So all what I'm going to suggest here, the enormous difference in the height of the two sets of columns reflect what happens with the dynamism or lack thereof of the whole private sector and also more generally of the economy in countries that manage to avoid state capture versus countries that exhibited state capture. These are among the post-socialist countries in transition. So out of those 27 countries, it's a ratio of 2 to 1 in terms of the growth of the private sector, who are not the captors. The captors, that small elite, manages to benefit particularly in a captured setting. And that's because they buy, essentially, that influence, but it's at the expense, as we see in the graph, of everybody else. And it's much less growth, there's much less investment, and there's much less revenue for the company. And importantly, which is not in this graph, and as I mentioned before, there's much less protection of property rights for the regular company, the regular firm, which is not the captor. The captors buy their own, they privatize, they buy own protection of the property rights, and they do well. And they do, in fact, 5 times better in terms of the extent of protection of property right than the non-captor firm in countries that have been subject to capture. The others, countries that have managed to avoid capture, do well, very well in terms of property rights. So that's one aspect of obviously the cost. If you can go to the next slide,
yes.
To broaden the discussion, that comes from separate work, which takes the whole world data that we have had and we have monitored, and we have a set of indicators that we started developing already in the 90s for 20 years, which are called the Worldwide Governance Indicator, with my partner in this since then, Art Cray. So we can use the data from throughout the world about governance, including one of the dimensions is control of corruption, which also includes capture. So this is more general. What happens in countries that over time have exhibited high corruption versus medium level corruptions versus low corruptions? There's an extreme difference in terms of the levels of well-being of the population between those. And that gives a sense not only about the cost of corruption, but also about the promise and the potential payoff, we call it dividend, of improving governance, controlling state capture, controlling corruption. And just to give one point of data, which is part of that research, a country that decides to embark on serious governance, institutional reforms to tackle corruption and state capture in a realistic manner, which doesn't mean no country can go from being the worst in the world even in 5 years to being at the top. A realistic manner is basically traversing about 1/5 of what the distance between the worst and the best of the world, which is totally realistic in statistical terms, is 1 standard deviation. So a country that improves realistically, significant reforms, but realistic improvement, that's associated with an improvement in per capita income for every citizen, if it's distributed, by 3 times. It's a tripling of income per capita. If the country has income per capita of $10,000 per year today, can expect in the long term, it takes time to reap the benefits, to have $30,000. So that applies to income per capita. That also applies to, we have seen it in the data, and it's causal. It goes from improving control of corruption to these impacts. It's lessening of inequality, lessening of illiteracy, better education gains, and also, very importantly, much better investments. As I said earlier, and that's associated with research of others, I'm not in that field, it also strengthens national security of the country. The whole issues around also migration, national security, around corruption in security services and so on is very important. And lastly but not least, as mentioned, it also improves much the prospects of democratic institutions. So it has a major also very healthy political dimension.
Yes. And then you had mentioned in your statement recession in Brazil, in the case of Brazil. Am I correct? Yes.
Well, thank you for the question. And Mr. Chairman, that's a flip side of, I just tried to put it in perspective,
yes,
and very positive terms. What if a country does it? But a country that has been enmeshed on this corruption, and indeed what we show in our research is the longer term, medium and longer term impact. But nowadays, particularly when a country goes downhill in terms of corruption and state capture, the impact is not in the long term. The income can be very, very large, and it can be in the short term, and it's not only about general well-being objectives, it's also about the basic macroeconomic financial indicators. Budget deficits go up, financial crises ensue, and the rate of growth of GDP comes to a halt very quickly. Brazil, in fact, for the first time in an extremely long time, after a very robust period of growth, entered a recession, of which they are now trying to get out. They're just barely back to zero growth after being in the negative territory for a couple of years as a result of what happened. In Peru and some other countries, because of the transnational nature of these major state capture events, there have been a major impact not only on GDP, but on the paralysis, the sudden halt and paralysis of infrastructure investments, since much of the capture was associated with construction and infrastructure companies and so on, in some cases that have come to a halt. So this shows in real time and concretely on the ground that this is not just abstract numbers, is of what's happening, and that's a major cost for the middle class and for the poor that ultimately it takes the brunt of this problem. At the financial level, one more comment. This has become such a serious concern and issue that the International Monetary Fund, that in the past was not very focused on these issues because their remit was short-term financial issues. So corruption, state capture was a bit more foreign to an organization like that. The World Bank was dealing more with that. But now the IMF has taken significant leadership and concern on that, and they have coined a new term for the impact, potential impact of state capture and corruption in a number of countries. They call it macro-critical. I've mentioned that before, given the concern of that. And this is an example of that. Brazil was emblematic case for these type of organizations, and looking at it more international, that this can have a major impact for the whole macroeconomy of the country, which implies major impact for the poor and the middle class.
Yes. So in summary, with that, with the last slide, that the sooner you act on any suspicion or allegations of corruption and state capture, the better for a country.
Obviously, yes. It's incredibly important, as mentioned before, the role of the judiciary, and not only that the proper prosecutions take place and there's no impunity as a result, but it's very important that it sends such a clear signal to the population, also to investors abroad and so on, which plays then not only an enforcement role, but a deterrent role, because the more that there is no impunity and there is a real sanction involved with acting in this form, the less that you're going to have those type of cases in the future. At the end of the day, we're all humans. We all make cost-benefit calculations. Is it worth it or not? Of course, we have our ethics too, but incentives play a key role. Nowadays in the United States, and again, talking about the strengths of the United States, you're not supposed, and by law, you cannot evade taxes, okay? Only about 1% of the taxpayers are audited, because these are millions and millions, it's extremely expensive and so on. However, if you're audited and you're found to have evaded, you go to jail, and you do. And politicians and others, and right now in the Mueller case, there are some cases that how they're doing it. So as a result, the extent of tax evasion is not very large in a country like that. So it's not that you need to be auditing everything like that, but rule of law does work, and people know here there is a sanction. One doesn't mess around with that. So it's just to exemplify that it does. It's very important that the judiciary is functioning in any place, and there's no impunity, because it also plays a deterrent role. At the same time, as a lead-off from your question, it's absolutely crucial in any country to also embark and make progress on the complementary issues and reforms that are absolutely essential, because no single progress on just one dimension is going to make the difference alone. And that's only for you to know regarding South Africa in the systemic sense, how much, whether issues regarding safeguarding the budget from being looted, what needs to be done with state-owned enterprise, what needs to be done with political finance campaign, what needs to be done in other political realms. What I was telling about Chile, you would know best. It would be my hope. This is such an impressive initiative that you have all undertaken, that this also creates a space to discuss not only the issues of prosecutions and the very, very important but narrow legal issues that you're discussing, but to have the space of discussing more broadly what's absolutely essential as well in other realms regarding addressing state capture.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for your evidence. Would it be correct to say, in the end, the whole idea behind anyone who might be wishing to capture a state is to have influence on certain decision-making institutions and functionaries within a state, so that ultimately they may have financial or business benefits, or are there other motives or goals?
Very important question, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Deputy Chief Justice. Obviously, from our experience in other places, the traditional and boring answer is going to be both. The whole issue of financial motivation is obviously a very important driver of human nature for reasons that you know better than I do, we all know well. But that's not the only motivator. We're also obviously, we collectively and in different degrees, driven by power. There are many people who accept to serve in public service on positions of leadership, and they're not full integrity, and I've met so many in so many countries, and that it's not for financial gain, but to have a major influence in policymaker and that power to do so, but for the public good. It's a very important driver. Many of us in think tanks, academics, I head an organization which is an international institution of that. We also advocate with evidence for improved governance transparency in natural resources for the benefits of the citizens of the country. I come from Chile, my colleagues come from all over the world. We want ultimately all the benefits. That drives us, and that drives many of you in public service at all. So the financial motives is not the only thing that obviously it drives it. That's the first point. But even if the main driver, particularly by those that want to capture for their own financial benefit, is purely financial and economic, it makes a very big difference if that's in the context of enormous competition in terms of lobbying and political influencing, or it's in the context of the political influencing. The extent of that political economic influencing by the few has become monopolized. The moment that has become monopolized, and it's the relationship between the few in the elite, in the economic financial elite, with the top political leadership or with the lawmakers in parliament, it can be extremely damaging and distorting. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the intention to influence, it's part of human nature, and many organizations and groups do, and we do it in the voting booth every time that we vote also, and we're trying to influence. That's legitimate. But that's why it's so important to look at the extent to which the whole system of political influencing has been distorted or not whether via political campaign finance, via the way that the political parties elect and monitor their own leaders, and by the issues of conflict of interest, lobby laws, all what we discuss. It's what's important. In short, one cannot ban by fiat influencing. That's in the human nature, but one can regulate it and ensure that the system put in place, which is not just through laws, but through institutions and so on, provides more of a level playing field regarding such influencing. Emblematic case, this exists. Emblematic case are obviously the Scandinavian countries. They do have a social compact among with the whole population of what's legitimate and how to move forward, and a certain modicum of equality, both political, economic, and so on. Canada is a very interesting case that has made significant progress in those. So these models and these systems is not at an academic level. They do exist, and they have achieved consensus in how to move forward. And at a more practical and micro or institutional level, if you allow me to mention exciting initiatives that are taking place and innovations in this day and age in many countries, refer, and you had it to your Reconciliation Commission, which in Chile, there was a lot of mutual interest because we had our own after Pinochet and so on. There is increasing effectiveness and interest in multi-stakeholder type of institutional arrangements to reach consensus about key issues in society. So about improved governance and anti-corruption in natural resources, we have this global initiative, which is Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. This is where we have to agree among the key representatives of government, of industry, of investors, as well as civil society, think tanks, and so on. And something happens when this is done in such a consensus form. It is my measured sense that in the context of improved governance and corruption, it's really important when these initiatives do embrace and involve also this multi-stakeholder nature, engaging civil society, the leaders in think tanks, as well as the leadership in industry itself, the enlightened leadership. Every country does have that, and we have been witnessing some from the banking system and others. In no country, it's just that this whole group, they're all tainted and so on, and others. They are leaders with integrity and reformists among all stakeholders, just like there are others who have other interests. But it's very interesting and important how these multi-stakeholder initiatives can also make progress. And through the commendable work of your commission, if that could be also perhaps a venue to engage in that discussion, and which in some other countries that has allowed for a broader type of consensus regarding the need to move ahead for these reasons. I'm not mentioning or referring at all to the legal aspects of that, which you have a very particular mandate and you know best. But from my experience in many other countries, the whole notion of moving forward, whether through one commission or separately, with a multi-stakeholder dynamic discussion and debate, and trying to arrive at consensus in society with that, it's something that could, in the case of Chile, we have done it in the case of anti-corruption recently and so on, and there are other such examples.
Now, you mentioned that in your research, you found that in some cases of state capture, what happens is that certain groups want to change the laws and the policies of government so as to suit their ends. I would imagine that in a case where it's difficult to change laws in terms of the constitutional and legal system of a particular country, they might want to look at people who have power, people who serve in certain institutions of government, people who occupy certain positions of in government, and therefore seek to ensure that it is people that can do what they want them to do. Does that sound consistent with your experience in terms of research?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Chairman. One of the vehicles of capture, in fact, rather than the indirect influencing from still staying supposedly on the outside of government, but through political campaign finance or through other illicit means, bribes themselves and so on, that's one way. But the influencing on who would be in a high position of power and who would be in the cabinet is obviously such a form. In some countries, it's no secret. In the post-Soviet era, there was even an informal price tag associated with how much a particular ministry, capturing it and putting one's own person would cost. And it was interesting to see the differences across ministries, which was again related to the question of what are the most vulnerable sectors where rents can be accrued. If the country was oil rich, obviously Ministry of Oil versus the Ministry of Agriculture and so on. So the answer is yes, unfortunately. That is one of the vehicles, one of the mechanisms by which that can be accomplished. But let's keep in mind also that, some countries go through increasing sophistication, development, and so on, like many countries here, and so on. So over time, the form of corruptions and the form of state capture morphs, changes, or that. So they evolve over time. So at a particular vulnerable time, in terms of the institutions, they may be placing directly the cabinet ministers. In some cases, some of the oligarchs, quote-unquote oligarchs, become the leader of the state themselves. It has happened too. Then over time, governance, institutions evolve, they strengthen, but that doesn't mean that state capture necessarily disappears. It takes a while, but then other forms which are more subtle through the political finance context and so on take more prominence. The ability to adapt and see opportunities obviously should not be not only be a major priority for reformists, but unfortunately is also what the other side is always looking, how to adapt to the new policies and so on that are trying to counter those forces of capture.
You spoke also about state-owned enterprises and that they can be a target for state capture. And from what you have said, it seems that you would be saying to us that talking generally, to the extent that state-owned enterprises could be easy targets for state capture, that it would be important to ensure that the legal framework, for example, for the appointment of boards of those state enterprises should be strong and transparent. Maybe the appointments should be very transparent so that in that way one minimizes the prospects that somebody, one person, may just put in all the people that he or she wants to put in if all the power depends on one person to constitute boards of such entities. What would be your comment on that? Is my reading of what you say correct?
Absolutely correct, and that's a paramount and one of the main concerns in a number of state-owned enterprises we have looked at around the world. I would even extend it, not only about the board is crucial, how the board is appointed, but then, and I would add to strong and transparent, even if it's embedded in the notion you just said of strong, the explicit notion of meritocratic. So that's extremely important. I would expand it also to the chief executives, to the top executives of the state-owned enterprises, and then the regulations and laws that govern the independence by which they can operate. The clarity of their remit is crucial. Deliberately, many of the state-owned enterprises, the remit, it's either unclear even in the books, or even if it is in the books, it's not followed, and they take over the production and regulatory remit at the same time, when there should be total worlds and should different institutions taking it. Just to illustrate that does happen in the oil sector, where major state-owned enterprises take both remits on that, and that creates all kinds of misgovernance and potential conflict of interest. And there are many other such issues that need to be clarified. Transparency also applies to their financial accounts, it's state-owned enterprises, so that everybody can monitor that. So you are absolutely right. It's like what we were discussing before as to how to tackle state capture more generally. These, what you just mentioned and referred in my testimony regarding the appointment of board, is crucial, but ought not to be seen as the silver bullet on its own alone. Necessary, but not sufficient, and the rest of the homework, of course, will depend on the diagnostic of each country and state-owned enterprise, but the rest of the homework in these other dimensions is very important as well to complement that initiative regarding the board appointment.
Well, I guess you may or may not say the same thing with regard to the appointment, for example, of directors general in different government departments. Now, in South Africa, directors general, I think, generally would be appointed. I think one of the witnesses told us by, I think, the president, at least at a certain stage, it was the president. I don't know if at another stage it was the minister, or there was consultation between the two. But The Director General is like the Chief Executive Officer of the Government Department. And it would seem, based on what you have told us, that it may well be that if the appointment of Directors General happens in a certain way, that might encourage state capture, but if it is done in a certain way, maybe very transparently and so on, maybe it might not. So I just want you to comment on that, or whether you would limit what you said to state-owned enterprises in terms of boards and their chief executive officers.
That's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman, because we have to acknowledge that it becomes more nuanced regarding senior level appointments in government, because there is a legitimate political process. There's a reason why a particular leader with a political backing is elected into power, and that's a part of the political process. And then every country differs. There's a legitimate question, the extent to which those appointments and how far down should be of a political nature, and from where it's absolutely crucial to safeguard the integrity, meritocratic technical integrity of the civil service. And that should not be. There's consensus in terms of best practices around the world that should not be touched by the political process. There was a time I studied this issue in particular depth many, many years ago. So this doesn't reflect the current era. But there was a time 20 years ago when I looked at this issue, say, in countries like Bolivia, small country, government change, 60,000 civil servants and public officials were changed as a result of change. In Japan, at the time, the mandated changes were 18, just the ministers, for political reasons. So, and of course, the reality around the world is somewhere in between. And that's very different in state-owned enterprises that basically has to play a certain role in terms of maintaining and safeguarding the independence and functioning in an efficient and commercial way. Otherwise, it can be an enormous drag, economic and social drag on society. So it's paramount that, because at the end of the day, that's the difference. The last word is state-owned, but it's an enterprise. If it's going to be an enterprise in this day and age and not be a major drain ultimately on the taxpayer that pays for that, that's absolutely crucial. So, but having said that, in terms of director generals and even those decisions that are decided to be political decisions, certain systems allow for that having an integrated degree of meritocracy in it. So at the end, the minister or the leader of that, basically they want to make a decision which has a political dimension. But, okay, I want to see the top 5 candidates that would come from a meritocratic system, and then among those top, I may have a political dimension of that, but at least choosing within a cadre of the most very highly qualified people with different dimensions and so on. So there are ways of integrating these with the political reality of any country and the political imperatives, but saying, but I still want to get the best possible person. So I will look at that list rather than having my person done in a way. The other question, and you raise it with state-owned enterprises, the more transparent the system, the more that it will encourage then, even if the ultimate decision has a political dimension, but it will encourage more credibility and more meritocracy in that ultimate decision making.
Do you have anything you can say about what you think could be done to protect, for example, a director general who is opposed to doing wrong. When, for example, his or her political master wants them to do something wrong. Now, if the Director General concerned, his or her continued employment as Director General really depends just on that one person, then there may be a risk of losing the job, and therefore that Director General doesn't get protected. But at the same time, one may have to look at what you have said to say, well, maybe Directors General fall within a certain category of persons where somebody in political office should be given room to put in whoever they want in order for them to achieve their goals in government. But I'm just wondering how one would balance the two to try and make sure that there is a framework or an environment that encourages Directors General to say no to any attempt to get them to do wrong, or to say no to state capture without being vulnerable to losing their jobs or being changed from one department to another, maybe for no good reason.
Again, Mr. Chairman, very difficult, and to again backstop the point that I'm not an expert in South Africa, and I know you're asking in general, but just showing my own ignorance. When you speak about Director General, you're referring within the ministries. Not a particular outside agency or something like that. We're talking within the
ministry.
Yeah. Okay.
In our system, a Director General is within a ministry,
right.
So it would be the President, the Deputy President, right. The Minister, then the Director General, and the right. Director General is basically the head of the administration of the department, whereas the Minister is political head of the department.
That's clear, yeah. In other countries in the region I've worked on, there have been permanent secretaries, others they are undersecretary in the United States or vice ministers and so on. Clear. And that makes the answer even more difficult. But in general, obviously a traditional response in this, but it has been full of challenges in the implementation, is whistleblower protection. The whistleblower protection is one of those examples where it's not that difficult to get consensus to adopt it and to put it in the laws and the regulation, yet at the end of the day, through loopholes and the way it's implemented, it doesn't necessarily end up fully protecting the whistleblower, even if in paper or in principle that may be the intention, that a person or that functionary who is under pressure may have serious doubts whether he or she will be indeed fully protected. So the first question is that any country would want to undertake, okay, how is our system of whistleblower protection, and not just what's written in the law? How is it being implemented, and do we know for a fact that it has really, truly protected? And that would have to imply that there could be no retribution, no sanction, and that would be, if there was retribution or sanction, that would be subject to high penalty for those doing so. Because again, we get back, and that's a second comment, to the issue of rule of law and judicial working. Ultimately, and I know that's where you seem to be going with a question, you would not want that undue pressure from the higher up to the permanent secretary or to the Director General to do the wrong thing. So what we want, and that's what we've tried to do, like in Chile and many other countries, to get to a situation where the Director General is capable of saying, do you know that if I do that, we both may end up in jail? I mean, so that's where the issue of penalty and sanction being really there. This is, by the way, the response at the international level, and I know I'm taking it away from the Director General, but I think the parallel applies. The response that many in the early days of, again, United States, some kudos in this case, the Foreign Corruption Practices Act, when it begins to be instituted and basically barring foreign bribery from the US at first, then it gets expanded to all OECD countries. Then when international executive would go to a country and a high official would say, yeah, well, we can do this deal, but you have to give me this or that under the table. The response was, you know that if I do that, I'll end up in jail, and you may end up on that. So that to make sure that a serious sanction for even that type of pressure and action would be an important deterrent, so that the Director General not only has to think, do I whistleblow or not, but be able to say, look, you know what will happen if we do this.
Thank you very much. Ms. Cofman, you are done.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Okay, is it you or is it Mr. Pretorius who will tell me what is envisaged from now on?
Mr. Pretorius will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The application in respect of at least one of the applicants will be heard tomorrow by arrangement at 10 o'clock. You should have or will shortly receive documentation in that respect. And thereafter we will announce the program for the following week.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Cofman. You have given us very useful insight into the issues of state capture, and I have no doubt that we will be enriched by the evidence you have given, and there may well be further communication between the legal team and yourself. Thank you very much. You are excused. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Thank you.
for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. We will then adjourn until tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I will then deal with Ms. Lynn Brown's application. That should not take long at all. And then we will announce tomorrow, after that application, what's going to happen for the rest of the week and next week. The proceedings are adjourned.